The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn of the house at 247 Magnolia Drive, a house worth $400,000. A house with white columns and black shutters and a wraparound porch where Vivian Ashworth had once dreamed of growing old. She stood on the sidewalk, now 67 years old, holding a single suitcase. The leather handle was worn smooth from decades of family vacations, trips to the beach, trips to the mountains, trips where she had packed for 4 people and unpacked for 4 people and never once complained because that was what wives did. That was what mothers did. Now she packed only for herself, and there was so little to pack. The suitcase contained 3 changes of clothes, a photo album with pictures of her children as babies, her mother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry Harold had not contested in the divorce, a small wooden box filled with seeds she had collected over the years without really knowing why. Everything else belonged to him now: the house, the furniture, the art on the walls that she had chosen and he had paid for, the garden she had planted and tended for 30 years, the life she had built brick by brick while believing it was theirs together. All of it, his. Vivian watched through the front window as Harold carried boxes from the garage. He was 69 years old, but moved with the energy of a man 20 years younger. That was what happened when you had something to look forward to, when you had a 37-year-old marketing director waiting in your bedroom. Brittany appeared in the doorway, blonde and lithe and young enough to be Vivian's daughter. She laughed at something Harold said, throwing her head back in that performative way young women did when they wanted older men to feel clever. Harold laughed too. Vivian had not heard him laugh like that in 15 years. She should feel something. Rage, perhaps. Betrayal. The burning humiliation of being replaced by a woman who had been in middle school when Vivian was changing diapers. But standing on that sidewalk with her single suitcase and her $30,000 settlement, she felt only a hollow kind of numbness, like a tooth that had been pulled so long ago, the socket no longer remembered pain. A moving truck sat in the driveway. 2 young men in matching uniforms carried Brittany's furniture into the house. Modern pieces, sleek and angular, and nothing like the antiques Vivian had spent decades collecting. Those antiques were already gone sold at an estate sale Harold had organized while the divorce was still being finalized. He had been thorough. She would later learn exactly how thorough. The front door opened and Harold stepped onto the porch. He wore khaki pants and a blue polo shirt, the weekend uniform of successful men in their late 60s. His silver hair was freshly cut. His smile was the same smile that had charmed her at a party 40 years ago. He did not walk toward her. He simply stood on his porch looking down at his former wife like she was a solicitor who had overstayed her welcome. "The check is in the mail," he called out. 30,000, just like we agreed, just like you agreed," Vivian said quietly. "With yourself," Harold shrugged. "The courts approved it, Viv. It's all legal." Legal. Such a small word for such a large betrayal. Vivian had signed those papers in a conference room with fluorescent lights, surrounded by lawyers who billed by the hour and spoke in language designed to confuse. She had signed because her own lawyer, a young woman fresh from law school and clearly outmatched, had advised her that fighting would only drain resources she did not have. The house was in Harold's name, had been since 1987 when he convinced her to transfer the title for tax purposes related to his construction business. She had agreed because she loved him, because she trusted him, because marriage meant partnership regardless of whose name appeared on paperwork. She had been spectacularly naive. Now she stood on a public sidewalk legally prohibited from stepping onto property where she had raised 2 children and hosted 37 Thanksgiving dinners and planted a rose garden that was just beginning to bloom. "Take care of yourself, Viv." Harold's voice carried the false warmth of a man who wanted witnesses to remember him as gracious. "Maybe travel somewhere. See the world. You've earned it." She had earned it. 38 years of marriage. 38 years of supporting his business and managing his home and raising his children. 38 years of putting aside her own dreams so he could build an empire. And she had earned $30,000. Less than $1,000 per year of service. Vivian picked up her suitcase and walked away without looking back. She did not see Brittany come out to stand beside Harold. She did not see them watch her go with the satisfied expressions of people who had won a game she never knew she was playing. She walked 3 blocks to the bus stop, sat on the plastic bench, and waited. The bus would take her to the extended stay motel on Highway 54. $189 per week paid in advance. A room barely larger than her former closet with a hot plate and a mini fridge and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. This was her life now, 67 years old and starting over with nothing. The bus arrived. Vivian climbed aboard, showed her pass, and found a seat near the back. An elderly man across the aisle nodded at her suitcase with knowing eyes. He had probably seen 1,000 women like her. Women of a certain age carrying everything they owned, wearing expressions of stunned disbelief. She nodded back. And as the bus pulled away from the stop, as the house at 247 Magnolia Drive disappeared behind the trees, Vivian allowed herself to remember how she had arrived at this moment. It began as so many things do with love. The year was 1979. Jimmy Carter was president. Gas cost 86 cents a gallon. And Vivian Marie Calloway was 22 years old, sitting in the biology building at North Carolina State University, finishing her senior thesis on drought-resistant plant species in the American Piedmont. She was going to be a botanist. That was the plan she had carried since childhood, since the summer afternoons, when her grandmother taught her the names of wildflowers and the secrets of making things grow. Vivian had a gift for plants, an intuition that went beyond textbooks and laboratory analysis. She could look at a patch of soil and understand what it needed. She could nurse dying seedlings back to health with nothing more than attention and patience. Her professors recognized this gift. They encouraged her to apply for graduate programs, study sustainable agriculture, join research teams working on food security in developing nations, change the world through the quiet miracle of making barren ground bloom. Then she met Harold Ashworth at a party. He was 24 years old, fresh from a business degree at Duke, full of ambition and charm, and the absolute certainty that he would build something magnificent. His father ran a small construction company in Raleigh. Harold planned to transform it into an empire. He saw Vivian across a crowded room and decided she was the woman he would marry. Not because he loved her, she would understand that later with the clarity of hindsight. He chose her because she was smart and steady and would make an excellent partner for an ambitious man. A woman who could manage a household and raise children and host dinner parties for clients. A woman whose intelligence would reflect well on him without ever threatening to overshadow. But Vivian did not know any of this at 22. She only knew that Harold Ashworth looked at her like she was the center of the universe, that he brought her flowers and wrote her poetry and told her she was the most remarkable woman he had ever met. They married 6 months after graduation. Too fast, her mother warned. Too soon. But Vivian was in love and Harold was insistent, and graduate school would always be there waiting. Except it wasn't. Marcus was born 1 year after the wedding, a difficult pregnancy that kept Vivian bedridden for 3 months. Then the sleepless nights of new motherhood, the endless demands of an infant who seemed determined never to sleep. By the time Marcus was walking, Vivian was pregnant again with Diane. Harold's construction company was growing. He needed her at home, managing the household, freeing him to work 18-hour days. They didn't need her income, he reminded her gently. The children needed their mother. Graduate school could wait. Graduate school waited and never came. The years accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, burying the young woman who had once dreamed of changing the world through botany. Vivian became a wife and mother and hostess and volunteer. She joined the garden club and the PTA and the various charitable organizations that successful men's wives were expected to support. She was good at all of it, excellent even. The Ashworth household ran like a precision machine because Vivian worked constantly behind the scenes, invisible and essential. But somewhere in a box in the attic, her senior thesis gathered dust. And somewhere in her heart, the botanist she had been slowly faded into memory. 40 years. 40 years of putting Harold first. 40 years of believing that her sacrifices mattered, that the partnership was real, that love meant building something together, even if only one name appeared on the documents. Then Harold met Brittany at a business conference in Charlotte. Vivian had suspected for months before he finally admitted the affair. The late nights, the sudden interest in fitness, the way he looked at his phone with a private smile. All the cliches that cheating husbands had performed since the beginning of time. When confrontation finally came, Harold did not apologize. He explained. He was almost 70 years old. Brittany made him feel alive again. Surely Vivian could understand. Surely she wanted him to be happy after all these years. The divorce proceedings revealed what he had really been doing during those months of late nights and private smiles. Moving money, consulting lawyers, positioning assets so that when the separation came, Vivian would receive the legal minimum and nothing more. The house had been in his name since 1987. The investment accounts were classified as business assets. The vacation property in the mountains was technically owned by his company. Everything they had built together, everything Vivian had contributed to through decades of unpaid labor, belonged legally and exclusively to Harold Ashworth. Her lawyer had explained this in the fluorescent conference room with genuine sympathy and absolute helplessness. North Carolina was an equitable distribution state, which sounded fair until you learned that equitable did not mean equal. It meant whatever the court decided was reasonable, and what was reasonable depended heavily on whose name appeared on which documents. Vivian could fight, of course, hire forensic accountants, subpoena records, drag the proceedings out for years while legal fees consumed whatever she might eventually win, or she could accept the $30,000 and walk away. She had walked away. And now she sat on a bus heading toward an extended stay motel, watching the life she had known disappear behind her like a landscape viewed through a departing train window. The motel room was exactly as depressing as she had expected. A double bed with a floral comforter that had been washed too many times. A television bolted to the dresser. A bathroom so small she could touch both walls simultaneously. Vivian unpacked her suitcase and sat on the edge of the bed. The check Harold had promised arrived 3 days later. $30,000 drawn on the account of Ashworth Construction, LLC. She deposited it in her own account at a bank she had chosen specifically because Harold had never done business there. $30,000, plus her teacher's pension from the 3 years she had worked before Marcus was born. $700 a month, $8,400 per year. She calculated the numbers with the same precision she had once applied to botanical research. The motel cost $756 per month. Food maybe $300 if she was careful. Transportation, insurance, incidentals. She could survive for perhaps 18 months before the money ran out completely. And then what Vivian was 67 years old with a 40-year-old degree and no recent work experience. The jobs available to women her age paid minimum wage and offered no benefits. Even those jobs were difficult to find when you were competing against applicants half your age. She spent the first week making phone calls. Marcus answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the impatient tone of a man interrupted during something important. "Mom, I heard about the settlement. Look, I know you're upset, but Dad's offering you $30,000. That's generous. You can get a nice apartment somewhere." "The house is worth $400,000, Vivian said quietly. "I lived there for 30 years. I raised you there. I maintained it, decorated it, made it a home while your father built his business." "Yeah, but it was in Dad's name. Legally, he didn't have to give you anything." "He's trying to be fair." Fair. Vivian understood in that moment what her son had become. A commercial real estate broker who measured value in dollars and contracts. A man who had learned from his father that success meant positioning assets and minimizing liability. She had raised him, rocked him through colic, walked him to his first day of school, helped him with homework every night for 12 years, paid for tutors when he struggled with math, celebrated every achievement, consoled every failure, loved him with the unconditional devotion that only mothers understand. And he had chosen his father's side because his father had money and connections and could help Marcus's career. "Mom, you still there? I'm here. Look, I've got a meeting. We'll talk soon. Okay? You'll figure this out. You always do." He hung up before she could respond. Diane called later that evening. Her tone was softer, more sympathetic, but ultimately just as pragmatic. "Mom, I know this is hard, but you need to be realistic. Dad's moving on with Brittany. You should focus on moving on too. Maybe take that money and travel." "Find yourself. Find myself," Vivian repeated, "as if I've been lost. You know what I mean? You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Now's your chance to do something just for you." Diane meant well. Vivian could hear the genuine concern beneath the cliched advice. But her daughter had also chosen to maintain a careful neutrality that just happened to favor the parent who could help with house down payments and grandchildren's college funds. Neither of her children offered a spare bedroom. Neither suggested she come stay while she figured things out. Neither seemed to notice that their mother was about to be homeless because their father had systematically stripped her of everything she had spent 4 decades building. She did not call them again. The weeks passed. Vivian developed a routine born of desperation and dwindling resources. Every morning she walked to the public library and used their computers to search for affordable housing. Every listing was too expensive, too far away, too small, or required income verification she could not provide. The waiting list for senior housing stretched years into the future. The apartments within her budget were in neighborhoods where she would not feel safe walking to the mailbox. She applied for jobs, part-time positions at garden centers, retail work at home improvement stores, anything that might use the botanical knowledge she had never entirely forgotten. But the applications disappeared into digital voids unanswered. She was overqualified, underexperienced, too old. The motel bill consumed money faster than she had calculated. Food cost more than she remembered. By the end of the third month, her $30,000 had shrunk to 22. By the end of the fourth month, 18,000. The math was merciless. Even with extreme frugality, even eating canned soup and walking everywhere, she would be broke within a year. And then she would be 68 years old with no home, no income, and no one willing to help. She started looking at different listings, not apartments, land, raw, undeveloped land in the rural counties surrounding Chapel Hill, property that cost less than a used car, plots that had been on the market for years because no one wanted them, land that conventional wisdom considered worthless. It was late one night, the motel room lit only by her laptop screen, when Vivian found it. 5 acres of undeveloped land in rural Chatham County, $8,000. The listing was almost apologetic in its honesty. Unimproved land, no water, no utilities, no access road, rocky, arid soil, unsuitable for conventional agriculture, no existing structures. Zoning allows residential use, but buyer responsible for all development costs, including well drilling, septic installation, and power line extension. Previous attempts at well drilling, unsuccessful. Property has been on market for 8 years. Motivated seller. 3 photographs accompanied the description. Barren rocky ground dotted with scrubby vegetation under a harsh sun. A few drought-stressed trees in the distance, clustered where the terrain dipped slightly. Cracked dry earth that looked like it hadn't seen rain in months. 8 years on the market. No water, no road, soil that couldn't grow anything. A terrible investment by any rational measure. The kind of property that would eat money in taxes and maintenance while remaining unusable for anything practical. Vivian stared at those photographs for a long time, and something stirred in her memory, something she had written 45 years ago in a university library, surrounded by research papers and plant specimens, and the absolute certainty that she would change the world. Her senior thesis, drought-resistant plant species in the American Piedmont, with particular emphasis on medicinal herbs native to iron-rich clay soils. The land in those photographs looked exactly like the soil profiles she had studied. Compacted clay with high mineral content, poor drainage, conditions that would kill conventional crops within weeks, but conditions that certain plants not only tolerated but thrived in. Echinacea purpurea, the purple cone flower used for immune support, which developed deeper root systems and higher concentrations of active compounds when grown in stress conditions. Various native salvias, medicinal sages that preferred poor rocky soil and produced essential oils more potent than their greenhouse-raised counterparts. Monarda species, bee balm with antimicrobial properties naturally adapted to clay-heavy earth. Asclepias tuberosa, butterfly weed once used extensively in traditional medicine, which absolutely required the well-drained mineral soil that other plants found impossible. Vivian's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the phone. The seller answered on the second ring, surprised that anyone was calling about the property at 9 o'clock at night. Yes, it was still available. No, he hadn't had a serious inquiry in over 2 years. Yes, she could see it tomorrow if she wanted. He would meet her there at 10. She barely slept. The next morning, Vivian drove her aging sedan 40 minutes outside Chapel Hill, navigating increasingly rural roads until pavement gave way to gravel and gravel gave way to rutted dirt. Her car protested every bump, the suspension groaning like an old man climbing stairs. But she pressed on. The property was marked by a faded for sale sign half buried in weeds. Vivian pulled over, got out, and stood in the morning sun looking at 5 acres of what everyone would call wasteland. The photographs had been accurate. Hard-packed clay mixed with rocks covered in patches of dried grass and tough, scrubby vegetation. A slight slope to the land with soil color variations that suggested different mineral content in different areas. A cluster of scraggly trees in one corner where the ground dipped evidence of some water collection during rains. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away. No power lines visible. No well. No road. Nothing. The seller arrived 10 minutes later, a tired-looking man in his 60s driving a dusty pickup. My father bought this place back in the 70s, he explained. Thought he'd build a retirement cabin? Never happened. Tried to drill a well 3 times, never hit water. Tried to get the county to extend power lines, too expensive. It's been sitting empty ever since. He watched Vivian walk the property, probably wondering why a well-dressed woman her age would be interested in land that couldn't support a tent, let alone a house. But Vivian wasn't looking at what the land couldn't do. She was looking at what it already was doing. The scrubby vegetation everyone dismissed as weeds. She recognized at least 7 species with medicinal applications. Wild bergamot growing in patches near the tree line. Native yarrow scattered across the rocky slopes. What looked like wild indigo pushing up through cracked earth. These plants hadn't been cultivated. They had seeded themselves naturally and survived without irrigation, without fertilizer, without any human intervention whatsoever. They had adapted to exactly these conditions. Vivian knelt down and picked up a handful of soil, letting it sift through her fingers. The texture was wrong for conventional agriculture. Too much clay, too compacted, too dry. But she felt the weight of iron in that soil, the minerals that gave it its reddish tint, the very characteristics that made it impossible for corn or soybeans, and perfect for medicinal herbs. She looked up at the seller. I'll take it. He blinked. You will $8,000 like the listing says. Don't you want to think about it? Maybe have someone look at the property. I've looked at it, Vivian said. That's enough. They completed the paperwork that afternoon in a title office in Pittsburgh. Cash transaction, no contingencies, no financing. Vivian wrote a check for $8,000 and received in return a deed to 5 acres of land that no one else had wanted for nearly a decade. The seller shook her hand with the expression of a man who couldn't quite believe his luck. Good luck with it, he said. You're going to need it. Vivian smiled but didn't argue. She drove back to the motel with her deed on the passenger seat, feeling something she hadn't felt in decades. Not happiness, exactly. Something more fundamental. Purpose. The phone calls began immediately. Marcus first, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. Mom, what are you doing, David? At the title office called me. He said you bought wasteland. 5 acres of nothing. No water, no power. You can't live there. There's no house. I'm aware, Vivian said calmly. Then why would you waste your money on that? Because it's mine. Nobody can take it. Nobody can tell me to leave. And I'm going to make something there. Make what, Mom? You're 67 years old. You can't build a house on raw land with no utilities. Be realistic. I was realistic for 38 years, Marcus. I was realistic when I gave up graduate school. Realistic when I transferred the house into your father's name. Realistic when I spent 4 decades supporting everyone's dreams except my own. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. I'm done being realistic. She hung up before Marcus could respond and did not answer when he called back. Diane tried a different approach that evening, her tone carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who had rehearsed the conversation. Mom, I'm worried about you. This doesn't sound like you. It sounds like a breakdown. Have you talked to anyone, a therapist? Maybe you should come stay with us for a few weeks while you figure this out. I don't need to stay with you, Vivian said. And I haven't had a breakdown. I've had a breakthrough into what living in a tent at your age. I have a degree in botany. I have 40 years of knowledge that I set aside because everyone told me it wasn't important. Now I'm going to use it. There was a long pause. Mom, I love you, but this is concerning. You're talking about living on undeveloped land at 67. What if you get hurt? What if you need help? Then I'll figure it out. Like everyone else has to when no one offers to help. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and long. I have to go, Diane said finally. We'll talk soon. They would not talk soon. They would not talk for nearly 2 years until a newspaper article and a 15-year-old girl changed everything. But Vivian didn't know that yet. She only knew that she was done waiting for permission, done asking for approval, done being the steady, reliable, invisible woman who held everything together while receiving nothing in return. She spent the next 2 weeks preparing. She bought a used pickup truck for $3,000 from a lot on the outskirts of town. It was 15 years old with rust spots and questionable brakes, but it ran well enough and had a bed large enough to haul supplies. She purchased camping equipment, a good tent rated for 3 seasons, a propane camp stove, a cooler, basic tools. Everything secondhand or on clearance because $14,000 would not last long if she wasn't careful. She visited the library and checked out books on homesteading, permaculture, water collection, solar power. She spent hours on YouTube watching videos about building simple structures, installing off-grid systems, surviving without utilities. And she retrieved from storage a box that had followed her through 3 different houses over 40 years, never unpacked, never discarded. Her botany textbooks, her research papers, her senior thesis with its careful analysis of drought-resistant medicinal plants. Seeds she had collected over the decades without really knowing why, stored in labeled envelopes in a wooden box her grandmother had given her. The knowledge was still there, buried under 40 years of domesticity, but still there, waiting for exactly this moment. On the first day of March, Vivian Ashworth drove her rusted pickup truck down the rutted dirt road to her 5 acres of wasteland. She was 67 years old. She had $14,000 remaining to her name. She had no water, no power, no shelter, and no backup plan whatsoever. She had a tent, a camp stove, a portable toilet, and a determination that surprised even herself. And she had knowledge. 40 years of botanical understanding that everyone had told her was worthless, that she herself had come to believe was worthless. Knowledge that had gathered dust in boxes while she made beds and cooked dinners and attended PTA meetings. Now she would see if knowledge had an expiration date. She set up her tent in the most sheltered spot she could find, where the land dipped slightly and the scraggly trees offered some protection from wind. She organized her supplies with military precision. She walked the perimeter of her property as the sun set, marking boundaries, noting features, planning. That first night she lay in her sleeping bag listening to sounds she hadn't heard in decades. Crickets, owls, the rustle of wind through dry grass. No traffic, no television, no neighbors arguing through thin motel walls. Just land and silence. And for the first time in 38 years, Vivian felt something she had forgotten was possible. She felt free, not happy. The loss was too fresh for happiness, not confident. The challenge ahead was too immense for confidence, but free in a way she had not been since she was 22 years old, standing in a university laboratory, dreaming of changing the world. That world had closed to her 4 decades ago. Now at 67, sleeping on the ground with nothing but a thin layer of nylon between her and the stars, she would build a new one, or die trying. Either way, it would be on her terms. The first month was about survival. Nothing more, nothing less. Vivian woke each morning before dawn, her body aching from sleeping on the ground, her joints protesting the cold that seeped through the tent walls. She was 67 years old and she had not slept on the ground since a camping trip with Harold in 1982. 35 years of soft mattresses in climate-controlled bedrooms had not prepared her for this. But she got up anyway. She heated water on her camp stove for instant coffee. She ate granola bars and canned fruit for breakfast. She used the portable camping toilet and buried the waste in a pit she had dug behind a cluster of trees. It was uncomfortable and humbling, and nothing like the life she had known. It was also entirely hers. The first task was understanding the land. Vivian walked every inch of her 5 acres during those early weeks, making notes in a spiral notebook she had bought at the dollar store. She documented soil composition in different areas, scraping samples into plastic bags for later testing. She tracked drainage patterns during the occasional spring rain, watching where water collected and where it ran off. She identified every plant species growing wild on the property, noting which ones thrived and what their presence indicated about underlying conditions. Her botany textbooks became her constant companions. She had not opened them in 40 years, but the knowledge returned faster than she expected. Like a language learned in childhood, temporarily forgotten, then suddenly fluent again when needed. The soil test confirmed what she had suspected: high iron content, heavy clay composition, acidic pH in most areas with patches of more alkaline earth near the tree line. Poor drainage overall, but with natural collection points where water pooled during rains. Conventional agriculture would fail here. The county extension office had probably told the previous owner exactly that, which is why he had given up and let the land sit empty for decades. But Vivian was not planning conventional agriculture. She was planning something much more specific. Water came first. Without water, nothing else mattered. No plants would grow. No person could survive. Water was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. Drilling a well was out of the question. The previous owner had tried 3 times at different locations, each attempt ending in dry holes and wasted money. Professional well drilling could cost $20,000 or more with no guarantee of success. Even if Vivian had been willing to spend her remaining savings on the attempt, the odds were against her. So she would collect water instead. Vivian spent 2 weeks designing and building a rainwater harvesting system using materials she gathered from various sources. Large food-grade barrels she bought used from a restaurant supply company for $50 each. Gutters and downspouts salvaged from a demolished building on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. PVC pipes and connectors from the hardware store. A filtration system she constructed herself using plans she found online with layers of gravel, sand, and activated charcoal. She built a simple collection structure first. 4 posts sunk into the ground supporting a slanted roof made of corrugated metal sheeting. The angle directed rainwater into gutters that fed into her barrel system. It was not sophisticated. It would not have impressed any engineer. But when the spring rains came in late March, she collected over 300 gallons in a single storm. Vivian stood in the rain watching water flow into her barrels, and she laughed out loud for the first time since the divorce. 300 gallons would not sustain a farm. It would barely sustain a person through a dry summer. But it was a start. It was proof that the system worked, that her calculations were correct, that survival on this land was possible. For longer-term water storage, she studied the land's natural drainage and identified a low area where water already collected during heavy rains. A natural depression that became muddy after storms and dried to cracked earth within days. She would turn it into a pond. The digging took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of waking before dawn and working until her body refused to continue. 2 weeks of blisters that broke and bled and calloused over. 2 weeks of muscles she had forgotten she possessed screaming in protest. She could not afford machinery. Even renting a small excavator would have cost hundreds of dollars she needed for other things. So she dug by hand with a shovel and a pickaxe and determination that bordered on obsession. The clay soil fought her every inch. It clung to her shovel heavy and dense, requiring tremendous effort to break loose. Rocks appeared at random depths, some small enough to toss aside others, requiring an hour of careful excavation. Her hands blistered through her work gloves. Her shoulders burned. Her lower back developed a constant ache that woke her at night. But every day the depression grew deeper. Every day the pond took shape. She lined the bottom with clay she had excavated, packing it tight to minimize water loss through seepage. She sloped the sides gradually to prevent erosion. She created a shallow shelf on one end where water-loving plants could eventually take root. When the next major storm came in mid-April, the pond filled. Vivian sat on the muddy bank, watching water collect in the basin she had created with nothing but her own labor, and she wept. Not from sadness, from something much more complex. 40 years of her life had been spent maintaining a house that was never really hers, decorating rooms that another woman now filled with modern furniture, tending a garden that someone else would harvest. This pond was hers. She had designed it. She had dug it. She had shaped the earth with her own hands until it held water. No one could take it away. The pond water was not drinkable without extensive treatment, but it would support plants and wildlife and provide humidity during the brutal summer months. For drinking water, she made weekly trips to town, filling 5-gallon containers at a public water station and rationing carefully. It was not convenient. It was not comfortable. It was possible. Soil improvement came next. The clay-heavy earth was compacted from years of neglect, depleted of the organic matter that would help retain moisture and support healthy root systems. Vivian could not afford to bring in truckloads of topsoil or commercial amendments. At current prices, properly preparing even 1 acre would have consumed her entire remaining savings. So she did what farmers had done for thousands of years before commercial agriculture existed. She composted. Every week, Vivian drove her rusted pickup truck to restaurants in Pittsburgh and Chapel Hill, collecting organic waste they would otherwise throw away. Vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, fruit peels, anything plant-based that was headed for the dumpster. Most restaurant managers looked at her like she was crazy, a 67-year-old woman in work clothes asking to take their garbage. But garbage was free, and Vivian had stopped caring what people thought of her. She gathered fallen leaves from parks and roadsides in autumn, filling her truck bed with materials that suburban homeowners considered waste. She hauled aged horse manure from a farm 10 miles away, whose owner was delighted to have someone take the mounting piles behind his barn. She built composting bins from salvaged wooden pallets, creating a system of 3 bins that allowed her to have material at different stages of decomposition. Fresh waste went into the first bin. Partially decomposed material moved to the second. Finished compost, dark and rich, and smelling of earth, came out of the third. Every few days, she turned the piles with a pitchfork, managing moisture levels, monitoring temperature, watching decomposition transform waste into black gold. It was not fast. Good compost took months to mature. But Vivian had time now. For the first time in decades, she had nothing but time. While waiting for compost to mature, she focused on preparing planting areas. She could not improve all 5 acres at once, so she selected a quarter-acre section with the best sun exposure and natural drainage. She broke up the compacted soil with a broad fork, a tool she had seen in old farming books and purchased used from an estate sale. The work was brutal, requiring her full body weight to drive the tines into the clay, then levering back to crack the hard pan without inverting the soil layers. Day after day, she worked that quarter acre, breaking, loosening, preparing. Her arms developed muscles she had not possessed since her 20s. Her hands became rough and calloused, the manicured nails she had maintained for decades now short, impractical, and often black with soil. Her face tanned and weathered from hours in the sun. She barely recognized herself in the small mirror she had hung inside her tent. But the woman looking back at her seemed more real than the one who had smiled politely at garden club meetings and charity galas. By June, 3 months after moving onto the land, Vivian had her first planting beds ready. She did not plant vegetables. She did not plant flowers. She planted medicine, native medicinal herbs, plants she had studied 45 years ago and never forgotten. Species that had evolved over thousands of years to thrive in exactly the conditions her land provided. Echinacea purpura, purple coneflower with its immune-supporting properties and distinctive spiny seed heads. This species preferred poor soil and minimal water, developing deeper root systems and higher concentrations of active compounds when stressed. Several native salvias, medicinal sages with antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties, naturally adapted to the rocky, well-drained conditions of the Carolina Piedmont. Monarda fistulosa, wild bergamot, a source of thymol and other antimicrobial compounds, which thrived in clay-heavy soils that would kill more delicate species. Asclepias tuberosa, butterfly weed once used extensively in traditional medicine, which actually required the mineral-rich, well-drained soil that other plants found impossible. She planted carefully, spacing widely to encourage extensive root development and reduce competition for the limited moisture. She mulched heavily with shredded bark she got free from a tree service company, suppressing weeds while protecting soil from the brutal summer sun. She watered sparingly from her rainwater barrels, giving each plant just enough to establish, then forcing them to send roots deep in search of moisture. It was stressful for the plants. That was the point. Stressed plants produced more defensive compounds, more of the alkaloids and terpenes and flavonoids that made them medicinally valuable. Greenhouse-grown herbs, pampered with perfect conditions, often contain lower concentrations of active ingredients than their wild counterparts. Vivian was essentially recreating wild conditions under controlled circumstances. It was a gamble. If the plants died, she would have wasted months of preparation and precious resources on seeds and amendments. If the summer drought proved too severe, if pests found her unprotected beds, if any of 100 things went wrong, she would be back to nothing. But the plants did not die. Day by day, week by week, they established themselves. Roots pushed deeper into the improved soil, finding moisture trapped in the clay layers below. Leaves unfurled, photosynthesizing energy for growth. Stems thickened and strengthened. By midsummer, her quarter-acre was covered in green. Not the lush, uniform green of a commercial operation. These plants grew in seemingly random patterns, spaced widely different species intermingled in ways that mimic natural ecosystems rather than agricultural rows. But they were growing. They were alive. They were hers. Vivian turned her attention to shelter. The tent had served its purpose through spring, but summer heat and eventual autumn cold would require something more substantial. She could not afford a contractor. She could not afford professional materials. But she had watched countless hours of YouTube videos on owner-built structures, and she had the most valuable resource of all, time and determination. She designed a simple building, 12 feet by 16 feet, not a house by any legal definition, but a structure that would provide shelter, storage, and workspace. She sketched plans in her notebook, calculated material quantities, and began gathering what she needed. The foundation was a concrete slab she poured herself over 2 exhausting days. She rented a small mixer for $40 and bought bags of concrete mix from the hardware store. 16 hours of work, most of it on her hands and knees, leveling and smoothing, left her with a solid floor that would support walls and keep moisture from seeping up from the ground. The frame came from lumber she purchased at a building supply store that offered discounts on slightly damaged materials. Boards with minor warps or small splits that were unsuitable for commercial construction, but perfectly adequate for her purposes. She built walls one at a time, framing sections on the ground before raising them into place. This was work meant for 2 people, and doing it alone required ingenuity. She rigged temporary braces. She used her truck as an anchor point for ropes. She worked slowly and carefully because a 67-year-old woman with no one to call for help could not afford a mistake. Windows came from a demolition site in Durham, where a contractor was tearing down an old office building. She offered $50 for 4 windows that would otherwise go into a dumpster. The contractor took her money and helped her load them into her truck, probably assuming she was eccentric but harmless. The door came from a Habitat for Humanity restore, slightly dented but fully functional. The roof was corrugated metal, the same material she had used for her water collection structure. Lightweight and durable, and within her budget. Insulation came from recycled denim bats purchased at a deep discount because the packaging was damaged. By late August, she had a building. Not beautiful, not up to any code, but solid and weatherproof and entirely constructed by her own hands. She ran electrical wiring from a small solar system she assembled from components purchased online. 4 panels mounted on a simple ground rack angled toward the southern sun. A charge controller. A battery bank made of deep-cycle marine batteries. An inverter that converted stored power into standard household current. The system produced enough electricity for lights, a small refrigerator, phone charging, and her laptop. Not enough for air conditioning or electric heating, not enough for power tools or appliances, but enough. She built an outdoor kitchen with a propane stove and a prep table made from reclaimed lumber. She installed a solar shower, a simple black bag that heated water through sun exposure. She converted her composting toilet system into a permanent installation more pleasant than the portable unit she had started with. The structure had no running water, no sewer connection, no certificate of occupancy, but it was shelter. It was hers, and it was enough. By her first autumn on the land, Vivian had transformed a quarter-acre of wasteland into something that resembled, if you squinted, a very small farm. Her plants had survived the summer, more than survived. Most species were thriving, developing the extensive root systems and woody stems that indicated long-term establishment. A few species had struggled, providing valuable data about what would and would not work in her specific microclimate. She documented everything in her notebooks. Temperature variations across the property, moisture retention in different soil preparations, growth rates of different species, pest damage, disease incidents, success and failure recorded with scientific precision. The botanist she had once been was coming back to life. September brought an unexpected visitor. Vivian was checking soil moisture around her echinacea beds when she heard a vehicle rumbling down the dirt road. She tensed instinctively, remembering Harold's surprise appearance at the divorce signing, the way he had smiled while taking everything. But the dusty pickup truck that emerged from the trees was not Harold's luxury SUV. A man climbed out, Early 70s, she guessed, with weathered skin and work-worn hands that suggested a lifetime of outdoor labor. He wore the practical clothes of someone who actually did things unlike the country club casual that Harold affected. He looked at the land around him with an evaluating gaze that missed nothing. Heard there was someone trying to farm this place, he said without preamble. Had to see it for myself. Name's Walter Brennan, retired from the Agricultural Extension Service. 40 years of telling people what would and wouldn't grow in this country. Vivian straightened, pushing her hair back from her face. What did they tell you about this land that a crazy woman bought it for nothing and moved into a tent? Walter's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. They didn't mention the solar panels, or the rain collection system, or the fact that you're growing echinacea in soil that's supposed to be useless. He walked past her without asking permission, examining her planting beds with the practiced eye of an expert. He knelt and pushed his fingers into the soil. He rubbed leaves between his thumb and forefinger, checking for disease. He studied her spacing and her mulching and her irrigation setup. This is good work, he said finally. Really good work. The plants are stressed but not dying. You're deliberately limiting water. Stressed plants produce more active compounds, Vivian said. It's in the literature. The defensive chemicals that make medicinal herbs valuable are produced in greater quantities when the plant is fighting to survive. Walter stood brushing soil from his knees. He looked at her with new respect. Where'd you learn that NC state? Class of 1980, botany with a focus on arid climate agriculture. 40 years ago, 45 actually, never used the degree until now. Walter nodded slowly. What made you start? Vivian considered the question. The honest answer was complicated. Divorce, betrayal, desperation, the realization that everything she had built for others was gone and the only thing remaining was knowledge everyone had told her was worthless. But she didn't know this man, didn't owe him her story. I had some land and some seeds, and sometimes, she said, seemed worth trying. Walter laughed, a genuine sound without mockery. That's the most sensible thing I've heard in years. Half the farmers in this county couldn't give you a straight answer like that. He walked the rest of her growing area, asking questions she could answer and nodding at her responses. He pointed out a few pest concerns she had missed, suggested some amendments that might help her soil retain moisture better, recommended a couple of additional species that would complement what she was already growing. And then, as he was getting back into his truck, he paused. My wife passed 3 years ago, cancer. Since then, I've been looking for something worthwhile to do with my time. Kids are across the country, don't have many people to talk to about the work I used to love. He looked back at her land, at the improbable garden emerging from impossible soil. Would you mind if I came by sometimes? Not to take over, this is clearly your project, but to consult. 40 years of agricultural extension experience might be useful. Why would you want to help me? Because what you're doing is interesting. You're taking genuinely bad land and making it productive using native species and sustainable techniques. That's exactly the kind of agriculture we should be promoting. Also, he paused, I'm lonely. This would give me something to engage with again. His honesty was disarming. Vivian considered. She had learned to be suspicious of help, of offers that came with hidden strings. Harold had offered help for 38 years, while systematically positioning himself to take everything. But Walter Brennan did not seem like Harold. He seemed like what he claimed to be, a retired expert looking for purpose. This is my land and my project, she said. I make the decisions. Absolutely. I'm just offering expertise when you want it. Then yes, you can come by. Walter became a regular presence over the following months, visiting once or twice a week in his dusty pickup. He brought knowledge and connections, introducing Vivian to other small farmers in the area, explaining market opportunities. She had not considered connecting her with the Organic Certification Board, but he never tried to take over, never suggested she was doing things wrong, never implied that a woman her age couldn't handle physical labor or complex decisions. He treated her as an equal, a colleague, something she had not experienced since her university days. Their relationship remained professional. Two people who had both lost partners, finding companionship in shared work without any romantic complications. It was enough. More than enough. The second growing season changed everything. Vivian expanded her cultivated area to a full acre using the compost she had been producing for over a year to improve new sections of soil. She diversified her species selection based on what had worked well in year one, adding new varieties while expanding production of her most successful plants. She built proper drying racks in her shelter, learning techniques for processing harvested herbs according to pharmaceutical standards, cutting at the right time, drying at the right temperature, storing in ways that preserved active compounds. And in June of her second year, Walter connected her with someone who would change the trajectory of everything. Dr. Claire Ashford, a pharmacognosist at the University of North Carolina, specializing in medicinal compounds derived from native plants. She had heard through academic channels about a woman growing traditional medicinal herbs using unusual techniques on marginal land. She was intrigued enough to request a visit, Doctor. Ashford arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June driving a university vehicle with faculty parking stickers and a bumper covered in Botanical Society decals. She was perhaps 50, with the practical demeanor of someone who spent more time in fields than offices. She brought sample collection equipment, test tubes, and bays and instruments Vivian recognized from her own university days, now far more sophisticated than anything she had used. For 3 hours, Dr. Ashford examined Vivian's plants with meticulous attention. She collected leaf samples and root samples and soil samples. She took photographs and measurements and copious notes. She asked questions about growing conditions, about water sources, about soil amendments. And then she returned to her laboratory. The phone call came 2 weeks later. Mrs. Ashworth, I need to show you something. Vivian drove to Chapel Hill the next morning, following directions to a building she had never entered during her own university days. Dr. Ashford's lab was filled with equipment that hummed and blinked and did things Vivian could only partially understand. But she understood the papers Dr. Ashford spread across the table. These are the results from your echinacea samples, Dr. Ashford said. I've been analyzing medicinal herbs for 20 years. I have never seen concentrations like this. She pointed to columns of numbers, comparisons with industry standards. Your plants are producing active compounds at nearly 3 times the concentration of commercially grown echinacea. The same pattern holds for your monarda and your salvias. Every species I tested showed significantly elevated levels of the compounds that make them medicinally valuable. Vivian studied the data, her rusty understanding of botanical chemistry slowly returning. The growing conditions, she said. The stress. Exactly. Dr. Ashford leaned forward with the excitement of a scientist who had found something unexpected. Plants produce these compounds as defensive mechanisms. When they're stressed by drought, by poor soil, by competition, they ramp up production of the chemicals that help them survive. Greenhouse operations optimize for biomass. They give plants perfect conditions, and the plants respond by growing large and fast and medicinally weak. Your plants are smaller, but they're essentially concentrated medicine. She paused, looking at Vivian with an expression of genuine respect. What you've done, probably without fully realizing it, is recreate the conditions that made wild harvested herbs more potent than cultivated ones, but in a controlled, sustainable way. The iron in the soil, Vivian said slowly, the clay composition, the drainage patterns, the very characteristics that made your land impossible for conventional agriculture make it ideal for high-potency medicinal herb production. The previous owners were trying to grow the wrong things. You grew the right things. She sat back. I'd like to include your farm in a research study we're conducting. We're looking at sustainable methods for producing high-quality medicinal plants. Your operation would be a perfect case study. It would involve regular visits from my graduate students, extensive documentation, ongoing analysis of your products. And in exchange, you get scientific validation of your methods. Data you can use to market your herbs as demonstrably superior to commercial alternatives. And eventually a publication in an academic journal that will establish your farm as a legitimate source of pharmaceutical-grade botanicals. Dr. Ashford smiled. Also, my students do good work, free labor basically in exchange for thesis material. Vivian agreed. The partnership with UNC Chapel Hill transformed her small operation from a survival experiment into something that attracted serious attention. Graduate students began visiting regularly, bringing equipment and expertise and an enthusiasm that reminded Vivian of her own university days. They documented everything with scientific rigor, creating a detailed record of her methods and their results. Word spread through agricultural and pharmaceutical networks. A small farm in North Carolina producing medicinal herbs with unusually high potency, sustainable methods on marginal land. An interesting story that combined innovation with improbability. In August of her second year, Vivian received an email from Victoria Sterling. Carolina Botanicals was a small but respected company based in Asheville, producing high-end herbal supplements and tinctures for health food stores and specialty pharmacies throughout the Southeast. Victoria Sterling, the founder and CEO, had built the company over 20 years, and she had heard about Vivian's operation through Dr. Ashford. She wanted to visit. Victoria arrived in a practical sedan, dressed in clothes that suggested money without flaunting it. She was perhaps 60 with silver-streaked hair and the direct gaze of someone who made decisions and lived with them. She walked Vivian's growing areas without speaking, examining plants, studying soil, observing infrastructure. She reviewed the lab analyses Dr. Ashford had shared. She asked pointed questions about production capacity, harvesting, schedules, processing methods. Then she sat on a rough wooden bench Vivian had built outside her shelter, looked at the acre of medicinal herbs stretching toward the tree line, and made an offer. Carolina Botanicals would purchase Vivian's entire harvest at premium organic prices. A multi-year contract guaranteeing a market for everything she could produce. $20,000 annually at a current production level, with increases as she scaled up. In return, Vivian would maintain her current methods. Stress-grown, small-batch, high-potency herbs that Carolina Botanicals would market as artisanal and exceptional. No pesticides, no commercial fertilizers, no compromises on quality for quantity. "I've been looking for a supplier like you for years," Victoria said. "Someone who understands that more isn't always better. That stressed plants make better medicine. Everyone else wants to maximize yield. You're maximizing value." She extended her hand. "Do we have a deal?" Vivian took the hand and shook it. They had a deal. By autumn of her second year on the land, Vivian Ashworth had transformed from a homeless divorcee into a legitimate business owner. $20,000 in guaranteed annual income, enough to cover her minimal living expenses with money left over for reinvestment. Not wealthy by any standard, but sustainable, independent. She had spent roughly $15,000 of her original $30,000 on land, truck, and setup. She had survived 18 months on the remaining $15,000 while building her operation. Now that operation was generating revenue. More importantly, she had purpose, direction, work that engaged her mind and body, a future that was entirely her own creation. That was when Harold showed up. Vivian was in her drying shed processing bundles of late-season echinacea when she heard a vehicle approaching. She stepped outside expecting Walter's familiar pickup, or perhaps one of Dr. Ashford's graduate students. Instead, she saw a black luxury SUV rolling down her dirt road trailing dust. Her stomach tightened. Harold climbed out slowly, looking overdressed and out of place in his business casual clothes and leather loafers. He gazed around the property with the evaluating expression of a man calculating value, assessing assets. They had not seen each other in almost 2 years. "Vivian," his tone attempted warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "You're hard to find. I had to ask around in town to get directions." "What do you want, Harold?" It was not a question. She did not invite him closer or offer hospitality. "I wanted to see how you were doing. I heard you'd bought some land out here." "I was concerned. You weren't concerned enough to return my calls for the first 6 months after the divorce." Why the sudden interest? Harold's expression flickered with something that might have been discomfort, or might have been calculation. "I've been hearing things about what you're doing here. Growing medicinal plants, working with UNC researchers. People are talking about it." I was surprised. He looked around again, taking in the shelter, the solar panels, the organized growing beds, the evidence of productivity. "This is impressive, Viv. More than I expected. But it's a lot of work for someone your age. Have you thought about selling?" His voice shifted into the reasonable tone she remembered from decades of discussions where he got his way and she agreed to whatever he wanted. "I could help you find a buyer. Maybe even buy it myself. This land could be worth something now that you've improved it." And there it was, the real reason he had come. "How much do you think it's worth?" Vivian asked, genuinely curious about his audacity. Harold performed a thoughtful expression. "Well, I'd have to assess properly, but with the improvements you've made, maybe 25 or 30,000. I'd be willing to give you 40 as a friendly gesture. That would give you a nice profit on your $8,000 investment." Vivian almost laughed. "Harold, I'm generating 20,000 a year in crop revenue from 1 acre with a multi-year contract. I'm expanding to 3 acres next year. This property isn't for sale, and even if it was, it would be worth considerably more than 40,000. Harold's expression shifted. The reasonable tone disappeared, replaced by something harder. "Vivian, be realistic. This is a lot of physical work. You're not getting any younger. Wouldn't you rather have the cash and less responsibility?" "Oh, no, no, Harold. This land is mine. This work is mine. This future is mine. You don't get to take it. Not this time." They stood facing each other across the bare ground. Two people who had shared a bed for 38 years and were now strangers. "I'm trying to help you," Harold said, but his voice carried an edge now. "No, you're trying to capitalize on work I did, just like you capitalized on my work for 38 years. I supported your business, raised your children, managed your home. You got to build an empire while I put my dreams on hold. And when I wasn't useful anymore, you discarded me." She stepped forward, and something in her expression made Harold step back. "Well, I'm done being useful to you." "That's not fair," he protested. "You're right. It's not fair. None of it was fair. But it's over. You need to leave." Harold stared at her for a long moment. His jaw worked as if he wanted to say something more. Then he turned abruptly and walked back to his SUV. The engine started. The black vehicle rolled back down the dirt road, trailing dust. Vivian watched until it disappeared. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the release of 38 years of suppressed anger. She expected that to be the end of it. Harold had tested her resolve, found it solid, and would move on to easier targets. She was wrong. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived at the post office box she had established in Pittsburgh. The letter was from a law firm in Raleigh. Expensive letterhead. Senior partners with names she recognized from Harold's business dealings. The content made her blood run cold. Harold Ashworth, through his attorneys, was filing a civil lawsuit against Vivian Ashworth, alleging fraudulent concealment during divorce proceedings. The complaint claimed that Vivian had hidden her business plans for the land she purchased with marital assets, specifically the $30,000 settlement. By failing to disclose these plans, she had deprived Harold of his rightful share of assets that should have been considered community property. The lawsuit demanded full accounting of all revenue generated by the farm. It requested partial ownership of the property and ongoing business operations. It asked for compensatory damages and legal fees. It was legal nonsense. Vivian understood that immediately. The divorce settlement had been final. The $30,000 was unequivocally her property to use as she chose. Harold had no claim whatsoever to anything she built afterward. But understanding that didn't stop the cold fear spreading through her chest. She drove to Pittsburgh that afternoon and met with her attorney, a practical woman named Janet Morrison, who had handled the divorce and was now visibly angry at what she was reading. "This is harassment," Janet said flatly. "The claims have no legal merit. The divorce settlement was final. Whatever you did with your money afterward is none of his business." "Then why is he doing it?" Janet sighed. "Because he can. Because fighting this will cost you money you'd rather spend elsewhere. Because the stress of litigation might make you willing to settle just to make it go away." She looked at Vivian with honest concern. "He's trying to bully you. He knows he'll probably lose eventually, but he's hoping the process itself will break you. This kind of lawsuit is designed to harass and exhaust." "How much will it cost to fight?" "It's hard to say. His lawyers will drag this out as long as possible. Motions, discovery, depositions. If he's committed to being vindictive, we could be looking at 50,000 or more over several years." $50,000. More than 2 years of revenue from her farm. Money she needed to expand to improve her operation to secure her future. "What if I settle?" That's what he's counting on. If you offer him anything, even a token amount to make him go away, he'll take it as proof that you'll break under pressure. And he might come back for more. Vivian sat in silence for a long moment. 38 years of marriage. 38 years of compromise and accommodation and putting Harold's needs ahead of her own. She had done everything right by the rules she had been taught, and it had left her with nothing. Now she had rebuilt. From bare ground and worthless soil, she had created something real and valuable, and entirely her own. and Harold wanted to take that too. I'm not settling, she said. Janet nodded slowly. Then we fight. But you should know this might get worse before it gets better. He might drag this out. Add claims, try to make it as difficult as possible. You need to be prepared for that. Vivian thought of the dirt road she had driven down 2 years ago. The land everyone said was worthless. The tent she had slept in through wind and rain. The blisters and aches and exhaustion of building everything from nothing. She had been prepared for hard things. She would be prepared for this. I understand, she said. We fight. She drove back to her farm as the sun set, casting long shadows across her acre of medicinal herbs. The plants were healthy, preparing for their autumn dormancy. The shelter she had built stood solid against the evening sky. Her pond reflected clouds turning pink and gold. None of this would exist if she had listened to the people who said it was impossible. Harold had taken her house, taken her savings, taken her children's loyalty. He had stripped her of everything she had built over 4 decades of faithful partnership, but he had not taken her knowledge, not taken her determination, not taken the capacity to create something from nothing. And he was not going to take this land, whatever it cost her, whatever it took. The lawsuit consumed the next 6 months of Vivian's life. Not completely. She still tended her plants, still harvested and dried and processed, still met with Dr. Ashford's graduate students and fulfilled her contract with Carolina Botanicals. Life continued because life had to continue because the herbs would not wait for legal proceedings to conclude. But beneath everything, the lawsuit was always there, a weight pressing down on every moment. Harold's attorneys were thorough and relentless. They filed motion after motion, requests for documents, demands for depositions, challenges to jurisdiction and procedure and standing. Every possible avenue of legal harassment was explored and exploited. Janet Morrison countered each move, but countering took time and money. Hours billed at rates Vivian could barely afford, court fees and filing costs, and expenses for copies and transcripts and expert consultations. By November, she had spent $8,000 on legal defense, money that should have gone toward expanding her operation, money that should have built a second drying shed, purchased equipment for processing, improved her infrastructure for winter. Instead, it went to lawyers. The stress affected her sleep. She lay awake in her small shelter, listening to wind against the walls, calculating how long she could sustain this. The lawsuit could drag on for years. Harold had resources she could not match. He could afford to lose $50,000 on a vindictive legal campaign and never notice the difference. She could not. Some nights she wondered if settling was the rational choice. Give Harold something, anything, just to make him go away. A few $1,000s to satisfy his pride. A token acknowledgement that he had power over her. But every time that thought surfaced, she remembered standing on the sidewalk with her single suitcase. Remembered the house she had maintained for 30 years being emptied of her presence. Remembered the laughing face of a 37-year-old woman moving into the bedroom where Vivian had slept for 3 decades. No, she had compromised enough. The phone calls from her children made everything worse. Marcus called in December, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had been asked to deliver a message and resented the task. Mom, Dad's really upset about this situation. He's trying to be reasonable and you're being stubborn. This lawsuit is expensive for everyone. Why can't you just compromise because I didn't do anything wrong? There's nothing to compromise about. He's our father, Marcus said, as if that explained everything. He's also the person who gave you $30,000 when he could have left you with nothing. He's the person who took a house worth $400,000 that I lived in for 30 years and gave me $30,000. He's the person who built a business while I raised you and managed his home. He's the person who chose to leave me for a woman your age. And now he's the person trying to take the one thing I built for myself. You're being vindictive. I'm being honest. And I'm done with this conversation. She hung up before Marcus could respond. Diane's approach was softer, but equally ineffective. Mom, I know you're upset with Dad. I get it. But this lawsuit is tearing the family apart. Can't you just talk to him? Maybe work something out for the sake of keeping the family together. The family was torn apart when your father had an affair and divorced me. And it was torn apart again when you and Marcus chose his side. I'm not the one who broke this family, Diane. There was a long pause. Mom, please. If you want a relationship with me, it's available. But it can't be conditional on me giving in to your father. I've spent enough of my life managing other people's feelings and compromising my own needs. I'm done." Diane hung up without another word. Neither of her children called again that winter. The loneliness was profound. Vivian had expected many things when she moved onto raw land at 67. Physical hardship, financial uncertainty, the challenge of building something from nothing. She had not expected to lose her children. Not through death or distance, but through the simple calculation of whose side offered more advantage. Marcus needed his father's business connections. Diane needed his financial support for her children's education. They had weighed their options and chosen accordingly. It hurt more than the divorce, more than losing the house, more than any physical hardship she had endured. But Vivian had learned something about herself over the past 2 years. She could survive hurt, could absorb it and keep moving, could tend to her plans and build her structures and do the work regardless of what weight she carried inside. Winter passed slowly on the farm. The herbs were dormant, but there was still work. Repairing infrastructure damaged by storms, planning expansions for spring, processing the last of the autumn harvest, maintaining compost systems in water collection, and all the small tasks that kept an operation running. Walter continued his visits, bringing coffee and conversation and the companionship of someone who understood both farming and loss. He never asked about the lawsuit directly, but his presence was a reminder that not everyone in the world operated from self-interest. Dr. Ashford's graduate students published preliminary findings in a small agricultural journal. The paper documented Vivian's methods and results, establishing scientific credibility for what she had accomplished. It was not major publication, but it was validation, proof that her work had value beyond what she could sell. The lawsuit ground forward through winter and into early spring. Depositions were scheduled and rescheduled. Documents were requested and produced. Janet Morrison filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the case had no legal merit. Harold's attorneys responded with a blizzard of procedural challenges. By March, Vivian had spent nearly $15,000 on legal fees. Her second-year revenue from Carolina Botanicals had been consumed almost entirely by the cost of defense. The expansion she had planned was indefinitely postponed. Her carefully built financial cushion had evaporated. She was not in danger of losing the farm. Not yet. But another year of this, another full season of legal bleeding, would begin to threaten everything she had built. Some nights she wondered if that was Harold's actual goal. Not to win the lawsuit, which he surely knew was baseless, but to destroy her through attrition, to prove that she could not survive without his permission. The thought made her angry in a way that felt almost cleansing. She would not give him that satisfaction. Whatever happened, she would not give him that. The reporter arrived in late April. Vivian was preparing planting beds for her third growing season when an unfamiliar car came down the dirt road. A practical sedan, neither expensive nor cheap. A woman emerged, perhaps 40, with the alert expression of someone who paid attention for a living. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm Catherine Mercer with the News and Observer. Do you have a few minutes?" Vivian straightened, wiping soil from her hands. "What's this about? I'm working on a story about sustainable agriculture in North Carolina. Dr. Ashford at UNC suggested I visit your operation. She said you're doing interesting work here." The journalist's eyes moved across the property, taking in details. The solar panels, the water collection system, the shelter Vivian had built herself, the acres of medicinal herbs just beginning to show spring growth. "I'd love to hear about how you got started, if you're willing to talk." Vivian considered. She had avoided publicity, preferring to work quietly and let her results speak for themselves. But Dr. Ashford's recommendation carried weight, and perhaps some visibility would help her business. "All right," she said, "I can show you around." For 2 hours, Vivian walked Catherine Mercer through her operation. She explained the principles behind stress cultivation, demonstrated her water collection and composting systems, shared the laboratory analyses showing elevated compound concentrations, described her partnership with Carolina Botanicals and the income it provided. Catherine asked intelligent questions. She took notes and photographs. She seemed genuinely interested in the agricultural innovation rather than any personal drama. Then, as they were walking back toward the shelter, Catherine paused. "Dr. Ashford mentioned you're dealing with some legal issues related to your ex-husband. She said it's affecting your ability to expand. Would you be willing to talk about that? Vivian hesitated. She had kept the lawsuit private, had not discussed it with anyone except Janet Morrison and Walter, had certainly not imagined talking about it to a reporter. But something in Catherine's expression suggested genuine interest rather than prurient curiosity, and something in Vivian's exhaustion wanted the truth to be spoken aloud. What exactly did Dr. Ashford tell you that your ex-husband is suing for a share of the business you built alone after your divorce? She called it predatory litigation. That's accurate. Catherine waited, notebook ready but not pushing. And Vivian, surprising herself, began to talk. She talked about the marriage, 38 years of supporting Harold's ambitions while setting aside her own. The house in his name, the careful legal positioning that left her with almost nothing when the divorce came. She talked about buying the land, the 5 acres no one wanted, the skepticism from everyone who thought she had lost her mind. She talked about building from nothing. The tent, the blisters, the backbreaking work of creating something from bare ground. And she talked about Harold's lawsuit, the claim that she had somehow defrauded him by not disclosing plans she didn't have when the settlement was signed, the legal harassment designed to drain her resources, the obvious goal of taking what she had built because he could not stand that she had built anything at all. Catherine took notes throughout her expression, shifting from professional interest to something that looked like anger. Would you be willing to let me look at the lawsuit filings? They're public record, but I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly. You can look at whatever you want. I have nothing to hide. Catherine left that afternoon with a folder of documents Vivian had provided. Court filings, financial records, laboratory analyses, everything that documented both her success and Harold's attempt to appropriate it. Vivian assumed the story, if it appeared at all, would be a small piece about sustainable agriculture, with perhaps a paragraph mentioning the legal difficulties. She was wrong. The article appeared 6 weeks later in early June. It was not small. It occupied the front page of the newspaper's business section with a photograph of Vivian standing in her herb field. The headline made her catch her breath. From divorcee to agricultural innovator. How one woman turned wasteland into profit and why her ex-husband wants a cut. Catherine had been thorough. The article detailed the divorce, the house worth $400,000, the $30,000 settlement that represented less than 10% of marital assets, the new wife 30 years younger, the children who had sided with their father. It documented Vivian's purchase of worthless land, her survival in a tent at 67, the knowledge she had set aside for 4 decades finally being used, the scientific validation of her methods, the business she had created from nothing. And it exposed the lawsuit in meticulous detail, the baseless claims, the obvious harassment strategy, the attempt to take ownership of something Harold had no role in creating. The disparity between a construction company owner with expensive lawyers and a 67-year-old woman defending herself with dwindling resources. Catherine had interviewed Dr. Ashford, who called Vivian's work agriculturally significant and her legal situation outrageous. Victoria Sterling from Carolina Botanicals described her as an invaluable partner being victimized by greed. Even Walter Brennan had spoken on record about her determination and innovation. The article concluded with a quote from Vivian herself. I spent 38 years building my husband's dream while setting my own aside. When that ended, I had almost nothing except knowledge everyone told me was worthless. I used that knowledge to create something real, something that helps people, something that proves 67 is not too late to start over. And now the man who took everything else wants to take this too. I won't let him. The story went viral. Not viral like a celebrity scandal or a political controversy, but viral by agricultural news standards. Viral among communities of sustainable farmers and small business owners and divorced women starting over. Viral in the circles that cared about justice and determination and proving skeptics wrong. It was picked up by farming blogs and sustainability websites. It showed up on social media with thousands of shares. Commentary accumulated about ageism and divorce law and the courage required to rebuild a life from nothing. Within a week, Vivian had received over 300 emails. Women her age sharing their own stories. Aspiring farmers asking for advice. Supporters offering encouragement. And then exactly 12 days after the article appeared, Janet Morrison called. "Vivian, are you sitting down?" What happened? Harold's lawyers just filed to dismiss the lawsuit. Without prejudice, which means they're not admitting they were wrong, but they're dropping it. Vivian sat down heavily on her wooden bench. Why? Because the publicity is destroying him. I've heard from colleagues in Raleigh that he's lost 2 major contracts since the article came out. Nobody wants to be associated with a man who divorced his wife of 38 years for a younger woman and then tried to steal her farm through the courts. Janet's voice carried satisfaction. He's cutting his losses, protecting his business by abandoning the lawsuit before it does more damage to his reputation. So it's over. It's over. He can't refile the same claims. You won, Vivian. You won. Vivian sat on her bench for a long time after hanging up looking at her farm. 3 years ago, she had stood on a sidewalk with a suitcase containing everything she owned. 3 years ago, she had been homeless and nearly broke and abandoned by everyone she had spent her life caring for. Now she owned 5 acres of productive land, a business generating reliable income, a reputation validated by scientists and journalists, and a community of supporters she had never sought. And Harold had lost, not because she had fought him with money or connections or legal maneuvering, but because the truth simply told had been more powerful than all his resources. She had won by succeeding, by refusing to be destroyed, by building something so obviously good that his attempt to take it exposed him for exactly what he was. The best revenge, she thought, was exactly what she had achieved. Finally living. Summer passed in a blur of growth and harvest and gradual recovery. Without legal fees consuming her income, Vivian could finally expand. She brought another acre into production, built a proper drying facility with better climate control, purchased equipment that made processing more efficient. Carolina Botanicals increased their order. The revenue from her third year exceeded $30,000. Not wealth by any measure, but stability. Independence. Enough. The attention from the newspaper article brought unexpected opportunities. Other women began contacting her. Women in their 60s and 70s who had gone through divorces or lost spouses. Women who felt like their useful years were over. Women who had read her story and wondered if maybe, just maybe, they could do something similar. At first, Vivian responded to emails individually, offering encouragement, sharing resources, answering questions about sustainable agriculture, and starting over. But the volume became overwhelming. Dozens of messages every week, more than she could answer while also running her farm. Walter suggested a different approach. You could teach them directly. Host a workshop. Share what you've learned in person instead of one email at a time. Vivian resisted initially. She was a farmer, not a teacher. Her strength was making things grow, not standing in front of groups and speaking. But the requests kept coming. And she remembered her own desperation 3 years ago. The hunger for guidance. The need to know that someone else had walked this path and survived. She scheduled a weekend workshop for October. Introduction to medicinal herb cultivation for small spaces. She expected perhaps 5 or 6 people, enough to test the concept without overwhelming her capacity. 23 women showed up. They ranged in age from 58 to 76. Some had farming backgrounds. Most did not. All had experienced some version of Vivian's story: divorce, widowhood, the sense that the productive part of their lives was over. Vivian taught them about soil testing and plant selection, about sustainable water use and processing techniques, about the patience required to build something lasting. But mostly she taught them by example, by showing what was possible when you refused to accept that knowledge expired at a certain age. At the end of the weekend, several participants asked when she would host another workshop. That first workshop led to quarterly sessions, then to a waiting list that exceeded her capacity, then to a small internship program where women could spend a month working on the farm, learning sustainable agriculture through immersion. Vivian built a simple bunkhouse to house interns. Walter helped develop curriculum. Dr. Ashford sent graduate students to present research. Victoria Sterling sponsored some of the programming through Carolina Botanicals. The farm became more than Vivian's livelihood. It became an educational center, a community, proof that second chances existed regardless of age. She called it Second Growth Farm. The name worked botanically. After a forest is cut or burned, the second growth that emerges is often stronger than the original. more resilient, better adapted to its environment. And the name worked metaphorically, because Vivian was second growth, and so were the women who came to learn from her. Harold remarried Brittany in a ceremony Vivian heard about through the agricultural community's gossip network. Apparently it was expensive and well-attended and featured in a regional society magazine. Vivian felt nothing about it. Not anger, not jealousy, not satisfaction. Harold belonged to a past life that no longer had power over her present. He was a man she had once known in the same way she had once known college classmates she would not recognize on the street. His choices were his own. His consequences were his own. She had moved beyond him in ways she could not have imagined 3 years ago. Marcus never reached out. Not after the lawsuit ended. Not after the article. Not when his mother's farm became locally famous. Not when the Agricultural Extension Service wrote a case study about her methods. Vivian understood. Some relationships could not be repaired. Some betrayals went too deep. Her son had chosen money and position over loyalty, and he would have to live with that choice. She thought about him sometimes. The baby she had rocked through colic. The boy she had walked to his first day of school. The young man she had believed would always love her. But thinking about him did not change anything, and grief she had learned was compatible with moving forward. The surprise came on a warm October afternoon. Vivian was teaching a workshop on fall planting when she noticed a car coming down the dirt road. Not a vehicle she recognized. A silver sedan moving slowly, uncertain. She excused herself from the workshop participants and walked toward the parking area as two people emerged from the car. Her daughter Diane, and a teenage girl Vivian had not seen since she was 12 years old. Chloe, her granddaughter. They stood by the car, both looking nervous. Diane wore an expression of someone expecting to be turned away. Chloe held herself with the uncertain confidence of 15 caught between childhood and adulthood. Vivian stopped a few feet from them, waiting. "Hi, Mom." Diane's voice was smaller than Vivian had ever heard it. "I know we haven't talked. I know I should have reached out sooner, but Chloe asked if she could come meet you, and I thought maybe—" She trailed off. Chloe stepped forward slightly, meeting her grandmother's eyes. "I read about you," she said. "The article from 2 years ago. And then I found your website for the farm, looked at all the pictures and the workshops and what you're teaching people." She paused. "Mom and Dad always said you were too busy to visit, that you'd moved away and didn't want to be bothered. But then I read the article and realized that wasn't true." Her voice carried the particular anger of a teenager discovering adults had lied. "They just didn't want to visit you because of Grandpa." Vivian looked at her granddaughter. The girl had grown so much in 3 years, taller than Vivian now, with Harold's features but something softer in her expression. Something that suggested she might not follow the family patterns that had brought so much pain. "You're right," Vivian said quietly. "That's what happened." Diane flinched but didn't argue. "I owe you an apology, Mom. A lot of apologies. I was scared to lose Dad's approval. I let that fear make me cruel to you. I convinced myself you were being unreasonable when really you were just standing up for yourself." Her voice broke slightly. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Vivian had imagined this moment during lonely winter nights, during the worst of the lawsuit. She had imagined what she would say if either of her children ever admitted what they had done. In her imagination, she had been cold, unforgiving, had made them understand exactly how much they had hurt her before offering any possibility of reconciliation. But standing here looking at her daughter's genuine remorse and her granddaughter's angry confusion, she felt none of that coldness. She felt tired and sad and surprisingly ready to let go. "Come see the farm," she said. She gave them a tour, showed them the growing areas and the drying shed and the processing room, introduced them to Walter, who happened to be visiting. "Let Chloe see the workshop in progress, 20 women learning sustainable agriculture from her 70-year-old grandmother." Chloe asked questions about everything: how the solar panels worked, what the different plants were used for, how you knew when to harvest. She had her grandmother's curiosity. Vivian could see it clearly. The same hunger for understanding that had driven her own fascination with botany half a century ago. Maybe it skipped a generation. Maybe it needed the right environment to emerge. But it was there, unmistakable. When they were alone again, Diane spoke carefully. "This is incredible, Mom. You built all this yourself. Not entirely alone. Walter helped with expertise. Dr. Ashford opened research doors. Victoria Sterling gave me a market. But yes, I built it. I'm proud of you. Diane's voice cracked. I know I don't have the right to say that after how I treated you, but I am, and I'm ashamed that I wasn't here to support you. Vivian considered her daughter, the woman Diane had become, the fear she had carried, the choice she had made to protect herself at her mother's expense. It was not nothing. The hurt was real and would not disappear simply because Diane had apologized. But it was also not everything. You can be here now, Vivian said, if you want to be. But I need you to understand something. I'm not going back to being who I was. I'm not going to be the mother who puts everyone else first and herself last. I'm not going to manage your relationship with your father or smooth over conflicts. I'm done being that person. I know. Diane wiped her eyes. And I don't want you to be. I want to know who you actually are, not who we needed you to be. It was the beginning, not of returning to their old relationship, but of building something new, something more honest. Chloe started visiting regularly. Summer breaks at first helping on the farm, learning about botany and sustainable agriculture. She had her grandmother's gift for plants, the same intuition about soil and water and timing. Vivian taught her everything she could, not because she expected Chloe to become a farmer, but because knowledge passed between generations was never wasted. Diane came sometimes too, cautiously rebuilding a relationship with her mother based on who Vivian actually was rather than who Diane had expected her to be. Marcus never called, never visited, never acknowledged that his mother had become someone worth knowing. Some relationships, Vivian learned, could not be repaired. Some damage went too deep. Some people chose their path and walked it to the end, regardless of what they lost along the way. She grieved for the son she had raised, for the relationship they would never have, for the grandchildren Marcus had that she would never know. But grief was not the same as defeat, and acceptance was not the same as surrender. She had built a new family, Walter's steady friendship, Dr. Ashford's professional partnership, the women who came through her workshops and internships, the community that had grown around Second Growth Farm. It was not what she had imagined at 22, when she dreamed of a life with Harold Ashworth. It was better. The fourth anniversary came on a warm October afternoon. Vivian had organized a celebration, an open house where current and former workshop participants, interns, research partners, and friends could gather to mark what she had built. She expected perhaps 50 people. Over 100 came. They arrived in cars and trucks and even a few buses organized by former participants who had traveled from other states. They brought food and flowers and handmade gifts. They set up folding chairs across the property and spilled onto every available surface. Walter gave a toast about agricultural innovation and sustainable practices. His voice cracked when he spoke about finding purpose again after his wife's death, about how Vivian's work had given him something to believe in during his darkest years. Dr. Ashford presented findings from 4 years of research conducted on the farm, data that would be published in a peer-reviewed journal establishing Second Growth Farm as a legitimate model for high-value medicinal herb production on marginal land. Victoria Sterling announced an expansion of their partnership. Carolina Botanicals would begin sourcing from farms trained using Vivian's methods. The techniques she had developed would spread across the region, helping other small farmers find success. Former workshop participants shared their stories. A 63-year-old woman who had started her own medicinal herb operation after learning from Vivian, now generating enough income to support herself after a devastating divorce. A 71-year-old widow who had begun teaching gardening classes at her local senior center, passing along knowledge she had gained at Second Growth Farm. A 68-year-old grandmother who had simply found purpose in community after years of isolation, who credited Vivian with showing her that age was not a limitation. One by one, they spoke about what they had learned, not just about plants, but about possibility, about refusing to accept that usefulness ended at a certain age, about building something meaningful from whatever resources remained. Vivian listened to all of it, and was sitting in a chair near her original shelter, surrounded by the farm she had built from nothing. Chloe sat beside her, now 17, planning to study botany in college. Diane stood nearby, finally comfortable in her mother's presence. Walter was there, and Dr. Ashford and Victoria Sterling, and dozens of women whose lives had intersected with Vivian's over the past 4 years. It was more than she had ever imagined on that sidewalk with her single suitcase, more than she had dared hope during those first months in a tent, more than she had believed possible when she bought 5 acres of land that everyone said was worthless. When the speeches ended and the food was served and the conversations scattered across the property, Vivian walked alone to the edge of her growing area. 4 years ago, this had been bare ground, cracked clay and rocks and scrubby vegetation that no one valued. Now it was 3 acres of thriving medicinal herbs, echinacea and salvia and monarda, and a dozen other species all producing compounds that help people heal. Beyond the cultivated area, she could see her pond full from recent rains reflecting the late afternoon sky. Her shelter stood solid, upgraded over the years, but still recognizable as the building she had constructed with her own hands. The dirt road stretched toward the highway, toward the world that had tried to tell her she was finished. She was 70 years old. 70 years old, and she had never been more alive. Not because she was young, not because she was wealthy, not because she had reclaimed what Harold had taken or reconciled with the children who had abandoned her, but because she had finally become who she was always meant to be. The botanist who had set aside her dreams for love, who had spent 4 decades in service to others, who had emerged from loss with nothing but knowledge and determination. The woman who had proved that knowledge does not expire, that difficult soil grows the strongest roots, that sometimes losing everything clears space for what you were actually supposed to build. The founder of Second Growth Farm, the proof that 67 was not an ending. It was exactly the right time to begin. The celebration continued as the sun set, casting golden light across the land that nobody had wanted. Laughter and conversation filled the air. Lives intersected and connected and drew strength from community. Vivian stood at the center of it all, not seeking attention, but simply present, available. The grandmother and teacher and farmer and survivor she had become. Tomorrow there would be work, harvesting and processing and planning for next season, teaching and consulting and building new partnerships, the endless labor of maintaining something alive. But tonight there was celebration. Tonight there was the proof that dreams do not age, that what the world dismisses as wasteland might be exactly the ground you need, that the strongest growth happens after everything else has been stripped away. Second Growth Farm would continue. The workshops would expand. The interns would learn and carry knowledge forward. The scientific research would document what was possible. The community would grow and strengthen and spread. And Vivian would keep growing too, both plants and herself, proving every day that 70, 80, 90 years old were exactly the right time to finally become who you were always meant to be. Because knowledge never expires. Because difficult soil grows the strongest roots. Because the best revenge is finally living. And because some women given enough time and enough loss and enough determination can make the impossible grow.